Third down defenses, defensive line pressure, and questions, lots of questions. And today's special Thursday edition of the mailbag. A Thursday edition of the mailbag. Are we really doing this? Yes, we are. It's a Thursday mailbag edition of the Morning Pitt here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. All right, it is Thursday, but we are doing the mailbag today. You know, we usually do it on Fridays, but we're getting this one in on Thursday, trying to work on a special guest for tomorrow. So we'll do mailbag today, and then hopefully the special guest for tomorrow, or else I'm going to have to think of something else to talk about. Get the old legal pad out and start jotting down some notes. You know what the deal is? I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com, the website right there, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com, the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet, football, basketball, and recruiting. Find it all at Panther-Lair.com and message boards to interact with hundreds and thousands of other Pitt fans. All day, every day, Pitt fans are talking about Pitt sports on Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com, and then our videos right here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That's our place for a lot of stuff. These daily Morning Pitt videos, Monday through Friday, that we release just a little bit of Pitt sports talk to get your day started. The weekly live show every Wednesday night at 8:30 p.m. like we did last night. Me and Jim Hammett get together and talk about the upcoming season. We have, weekly interviews and press conferences. We're going to have our first post-game show. Got that coming up on Saturday night. Still not entirely sure what time we're going to do that. I'm targeting maybe around like 9 o'clock, 8:30, 9 o'clock, somewhere around there on Saturday night. We'll get a beer, and we'll talk about Pitt Wofford after the game, see what we thought of that one. Those are always fun. We get the live streams, and people chime in with their comments and questions. Those are always a good time to do, and we do it right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. You want to make sure you don't forget to sign up for the, or you want to make sure you don't forget to tune in for the live show or miss any of our video content. The way to do it is to subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Turn on your notifications and you'll get an alert sent to your phone so you don't miss anything. youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Let's jump into the questions. I do want to give a quick shout out to myself for last week's mailbag. One of the questions, and I saw it as I was going through, is we had a bunch of questions left over last week that I didn't get a chance to get to last Friday. And so I was scrolling through that thread on the Between Fifth and Forbes message board. And I came across the question from our good friend Pitt Chag. Who's your pick for the starting point guard this year? Dior versus the field. And if you recall, I said the field. Shout out to me. It wasn't for the reasons that I thought it was going to be the field, but I ended up being right. And look, when it comes down to a question like that, are you taking Dior or the field? You take the field, you win regardless of the circumstances. I don't think they take the bet off the board just because Dior is no longer a student at the University of Pittsburgh. So that one pays, and it pays to me. All right, other comments and questions here, or other questions in the mailbag. Got some good ones here, and this is actually a relevant one. Johnny Gossamer asks, who's the extra DB in the Delta package this year? Also, because I forgot who was it last season after Battle went down. This is a great question, and it's an important one. And look, we're in year 9 of Pat Narduzzi's defense here, and I think he did something similar at Michigan State. But not everybody's aware of what we're talking about here with the Delta defense. It's typically Pitt's defensive package, sub-package on third down. It's what they've gone to basically since Narduzzi arrived. And what it is it's an extra defensive back, ultimately. They go, their base defense is a 4-3 defense, 4 down linemen, 3 linebackers, with some flexibility in there, particularly of one linebacker, being kind of a hybrid safety linebacker. But I mean, that's neither here nor there. It's a 4-3 defense with 4 defensive backs behind them, 2 corners and 2 safeties. But on third downs, third and long, passing down situations, mostly third, not so much like a 2nd and 12, depending on the team they're facing or situation in the game. But in those third down passing situations, they've gone to what they call the Delta defensive sub-package. And in the Delta, they take a defensive lineman off the field, usually a defensive tackle. They'll usually go with 2 ends and a tackle in the middle. And they'll add an extra defensive back. They call it the star, even though the star linebacker is and I guess it sort of functions in the same way. But it's the star linebacker is the star is a position in the 4-3 defense. It's the field side, the wide side of the field linebacker. And then when they go to the Delta, they've effectively use it like a 3-4 to some extent. It's not entirely that way, but it's kind of like a 3-4 with 3 down linemen and 4 linebackers. But where they get tricky is that extra guy they bring in. They've used a lot of different positions. For the most part, over the years, it's been a safety. It's been, I feel like Dennis Briggs played that role. I'm trying to think of some of the other safeties who've played that role over the years. In 2021, I think it was John Patrician largely played that role. And it was really the first time they made much of a departure from using a safety there. Patrician was a linebacker, but he was a former safety. Last year, you saw Rashad Battle, I think, work in that role a little bit early on, until he got hurt, and then Javon McIntyre really took over that position and was that extra defensive back, but he was still sort of lining up in the middle of the defense, not necessarily a traditional nickel slot corner type of thing, so it's not truly a nickel defense, and actually we've seen Pitt under Narduzzi use something more of a traditional nickel defense. I remember a few games against Syracuse where they would come out on a third down situation. Actually, they opened the game against Syracuse in this, I mean, what would truly be considered a classic nickel look of 4 down linemen, 2 linebackers, 3 corners, and 2 safeties. I wouldn't necessarily call the Delta that. I wouldn't call it a nickel defense. It's like I say, it's almost more of a 3-4 than it is a nickel, but they've switched it up with what players they've used as that extra defender. As that extra defensive back, or in the case of John Patrician, an extra linebacker. Now, last year they went back to using safeties, and they had Javon McIntyre out there. Obviously, McIntyre stepping into a starting role at strong safety, boundary safety this year. So they need another option. And Archie Collins said yesterday, the cornerbacks coach, defensive backs coach, Archie Collins, said A.J. Woods is going to be filling that role this year. That's the coach's plan right now. And I thought that was really interesting because they've used safeties a lot. They've even used a linebacker sometimes, but they haven't really used the cornerback in that role. And Woods is he's thick. We interviewed him on Tuesday actually, and he's well put together. He's not a skinny or really slight guy. He's a little bit on the shorter side, but he's bulky, I guess, or stocky, however you want to call it. I mean, he's got good size. He's filled out. He's a 5th-year player, and he's also super fast. I mean, that was always the thing coming out of high school, that he was a speed demon, and he was going. That was his biggest attribute, was his speed. And now they're going to put that on the field, and it's interesting how they want that position to play. And I can remember after a few years asking Pat Narduzzi why they use the safety in that role rather than bringing in a corner for a more traditional nickel look. And he said that, part of it was they wanted a guy who could cover, but also could play in run support. They didn't want to sacrifice against the run. If they're going to put someone in the box like that extra defender plays, they wanted to make sure it was someone who could be physical enough to stick their nose in if there's plays to be made within 7 yards of the line of scrimmage, 8 yards of the line of scrimmage. And so that was how it sort of made sense to use the safety, or in the case of Patrician, a former safety. A.J. Woods is a physical player. I don't think there's any question about that. I don't know if he's as physical as you would typically think of for a safety, but he's certainly got the speed. And I think, the speed and the physicality, the toughness, the veteran, knowledge that he's got because he's been in this defense for a long time. I think that all those things made him very appealing as an option there. And so it's going to have a different look. I think the Delta is going to look a little different this year just because they'll have 3 corners on the field as opposed to 3 safeties or 4 linebackers. Even if that extra defender, that corner, A.J. Woods, is playing in more of a linebacker alignment. Now, of course, it'll get really interesting if something happens, if there's an injury to A.J. Woods or Marquez Williams or M.J. Devonshire. If they, for some reason, need to replace one of those corners, it might depend on who they're replacing, but I'll be curious to see who they go with. If they go with a Rylan Gandy, if they go with a Steph Hall, a safety, or a Donovan McMillan as a safety, or bring in like a Steph Hall to play next to Javon McIntyre and move PJ O'Brien down into that role, or bring in a Hall or a McMillan to play next to O'Brien at safety and bring McIntyre back into that role that he knows and has played before and played well in before. But that's what the defensive sub package is, and that's who they like to use in that role. That's who they're going to use in that role this year. Joe Magarax says, based on your observations at training camp, how does this year's defensive line compare to the training camp performances of the D-lines of the last 5 years or so? Well, look, observations of training camp, We don't see a lot of D-line pass rushes. We don't see a lot of one-on-ones. We don't see inside run drills. We watch maybe a couple inside run plays. Or I don't even know if it was inside run plays. They might have just been 11-on-11 team drills. We don't see enough for me to sit here and tell you, well, it's better than the 2021 group, but it's not as good as the 2020 group or something like that. I can't make those comparisons. The most difficult thing about the defensive line, the defensive ends, and the pass rush this year is that it's largely unproven, particularly the defensive ends. Deion Hayes, Nate Temple, Bam Brima, Nikai Johnson, Sam Okunlola. I don't know. I don't know what to expect out of any of these guys. In some ways, we're counting on all of them to have career best years. And I talked yesterday about how part of the flaw with expecting Pitt's offense to improve in 2023 or be better in 23 than it was in 22, part of the flaw or one of the hangups I have is that we're counting on a lot of guys to have career best seasons. And that's a sobering thought, because when you're basing a lot of your hopes or beliefs or confidence on guys having career best seasons, multiple players having career best seasons, I mean, that gets a little concerning because you don't usually have that many guys having career best seasons in 1 year. Now, it's a little different at defensive end than it is at, say, wide receiver. I mean, Bub Means and Kanate Mumfield both played all year last year. They were featured players in the offense. They were starters. They were primary targets for Keaton Slovis. The defensive ends are a little bit different. Deion Hayes has played a decent amount. Nobody else really has. And so all of these guys are sort of poised for, a lot of these guys, if they get like 3 sacks, it's going to be a career best year, for basically everyone other than Deion Hayes. And so the bar is pretty low for what counts as a career best year, but we're still counting on these guys and basing optimism on these guys taking a leap forward and having the best seasons of their career. And you might get 1 or 2 of those, but are you going to get 4 or 5? Which is ultimately what they're going to need, is they're going to need all of those guys to step up and all of those guys to have big seasons. And it feels like a lot to count on. Now, counterpoint. They're all seemingly really talented players. Deion Hayes, Nikai Johnson, Sam Okunlola, they were all 4-star prospects. Nate Temple has been a guy who has gotten tons of praise this spring. I mean, Panarduzzi acted like Nate Temple should have been in this position all along. Should have been, playing at a high level and contributing in games all along, but he kept getting hurt. And to hear Narduzzi tell it, injuries were the reason that Nate Temple hasn't contributed yet in his college career. It's not about talent or getting outplayed or not being good enough or none of those things. It's about injuries. So we'll find out if Narduzzi's right. If he's right, you might have this sort of lightning in a bottle situation where everybody, the entire group, your top 4 or 5 players, all takes a giant leap forward. You might end up with that. It's possible. Nikai Johnson hasn't gotten a chance to show what he can or cannot do. Neither is Sam Okunlola. Really, Bam Brima has limited exposure here. Deion Hayes has played the most out of any of them. But it's completely conceivable that they could all, you could see better performances out of those guys. How does it compare to previous seasons? I really couldn't say. There's no Rashad Weaver or Patrick Jones on this group. I mean, at least in terms of historic performance, or career performance. There's not really even like a Haba Baldonado. I mean, I guess Hayes would probably be the closest thing to a Haba Baldonado in terms of his career and expectations. But again, it's hard to even draw those comparisons because, like, who do you compare Nate Temple to? I have no comparison for Nate Temple. I have no comparison for Nikai Johnson. I have no comparison for Sam Ogunlola. So it's really hard for me to compare this year's group to the previous year's groups because, to me, they're a bit of a blank slate. I don't know what you're going to get out of these guys. I have a pretty good, I think we have a fairly solid idea of what they're going to get out of Devin Danielson and David Green and Tyler Bentley. DeAndre Jules is a bit of a wild card. So we'll see there. But it's really about the ends and whether those defensive ends can take a big step forward. Calicos asks, with the 4-game allotment for redshirting, what freshmen do you think will play some but still preserve their redshirt? This is an interesting question. And a lot of times there'll be guys who like sort of surprise that they get more time than you would expect them to, but still manage to hold on to that red shirt. I mean, I think we've all sort of agreed that we don't think Kenny Johnson's going to redshirt. You got to think probably one of those other receivers will also not redshirt. I would say all four of the freshman wide receivers will play at some point this season. I'm going to guess that 2 redshirt and 2 don't. Which 2 remains to be seen. Maybe Fowler and Seymour and Polk. I don't know. I think Ty Diefenbach will redshirt. I don't think we'll see him in any games. The running backs are interesting. I could see Montrevious Lloyd playing enough to not redshirt this year. I could see TJ Harvison maybe getting a little bit of playing time, but still redshirting. Ryan Coretta, moving down, I'm just going through the list of freshmen here. Offensive lineman Ryan Coretta, Tyree, BJ Williams. I don't think we'll see any of those guys on the field. Even just a handful of games while preserving their red shirts. Ditto the defensive ends, Antonio Cayman and Maverick Gracio, and really the defensive tackle, Isaiah Neal. An injury or two could move him up the list, but at this point, I think it looks like he's going to be headed for a red shirt. And maybe not any playing time. Maybe he might end up with a couple of games late in the season, but I'm guessing we won't see much of him. The linebackers, Jordan Bass, Rasheem Biles, Braylon Lovelace, I'm going to guess that one of them plays enough to not redshirt and the other 2 stay under the redshirt cap. Maybe Bass and Biles might be my guess. That's just a guess. And then the DBs, Shadarian Harrison, Jesse Anderson, Cruz Brookins. I could see Brookins not redshirting, contributing on special teams and potentially at safety. Harrison, maybe the same. I could see Anderson staying under the 4 games, and I could kind of see Shadarian Harrison staying under the 4 games. That one's a tough call. How many guys if they're guys you are just using on special teams, do you really want to go above 4 games just to use them on like kick coverage? I'm not sure if that's worth it. Now, if you have ways to get Shadarian Harrison or Cruz Brookins into the game, or Bass or Biles into the game in the defense, and have those guys really get out there and play significant snaps, then sure, it's worth it. There's no sense holding on to the red shirt, particularly for guys who are not offensive linemen. I feel like offensive line is that one position that probably everybody should try to redshirt if they can. But everybody else, if you can get on the field and you can help, then do it. But it's a question of like how much special teams contributions does it take to justify burning a red shirt. All right. Let's see what other questions here. I know we got more. Spudda09 says, will we see another game at Pitt Stadium in our lifetime? The answer is no. Because even if they build a campus in Oakland, it's not going to have the name Pitt Stadium. That's my guess. It could be like Acrisure Field at Pitt Stadium. No, it wouldn't be Acrisure Field. But, it's one of those kind of things. Corporate sponsor field at Pitt Stadium. But my guess is no. You won't see anything called Pitt Stadium in your lifetime. I don't know. I don't know what's up with the stadium. Yeah, I mean, people talk about this all the time. People ask about this all the time. It's been coming up for 23 years. It'll come up for another 230 years. People will always be talking about this. Do I think that Pitt has looked into it? Yes. Do I think that Pitt might even believe they have a viable path toward accomplishing it? Maybe. Do I think they're actually going to do it? I got to see them break ground before I believe it. For like countless reasons that we've listed many, many times, from the challenges of putting another stadium into Oakland to the challenges of taking on $750 million in debt between the Victory Heights project and a potential stadium, and probably a number that might even climb higher than that. There's a lot that works against the idea of an on-campus stadium in Oakland. But I need to see them break ground before I believe that they're actually doing it. What else? Elliot, here, Hoya Panther says, Elliot Donald was a top 100 player in his recruiting class, but seems like he's not breaking through. Is that a function of defensive tackle being a position that favors upperclassmen, or is it possible he may not be the player we expected? And actually, the Special Sauce had a reply to that question and said a little bit of both. And I don't disagree. That would probably be my answer. A little bit of both. he has been behind Devin Danielson and David Green and Tyler Bentley and Kalijah Cansey since he got to Pitt. He's been playing behind some really good guys. Is it possible he was overrated as a recruit coming out of high school? Yeah, it's possible. Maybe even likely at this point. And that doesn't mean he can't become a good player. That doesn't mean he can't contribute down the line. That doesn't mean that he won't be good at Pitt. It just means that we probably had him overrated for whatever reason. He's still, got good size. He's still got good athleticism. I think he's going to be the book is far from closed on Elliot Donald, but I look at it right now, and obviously there's the 3 6th-year players. We hear a lot about DeAndre Jules. Sean Fitzsimmons is on the come up, and Isaiah Neal is coming up. I mean, Elliot Donald fits into that mix somewhere, just not really sure where, and I'm not really sure if it's this season. He'll be no worse than third team, I would say that. He'll be no worse than 5th or 6th. It's just a question of how much playing time 5 and 6 actually get. So we'll see. All right, great questions there today. I really appreciate everybody who participates. Remember, if you want to get a question in for the mailbag, go to the premium message boards, Between Fifth and Forbes message board. Submit your question. Each week we'll post a new mail thread, mailbag thread, mail time. And you can put your question in there, and we'll answer as many as we can. Excuse me. We'll answer as many as we can in the next week's mailbag. So we'll put up a new thread next week and get it started. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions coming out of the Wofford game and heading into Cincinnati. So you want to tune in and participate in that. Thanks again for tuning in today. I hope to have a special guest for you tomorrow. And if not, it'll just be me talking about Pitt versus Wofford. So what could be more thrilling than that, right? All right, thanks for tuning in today. Hope it's been a great week for you so far. We're almost to the end. And more importantly, we're almost to college football. Pitt football, at least. So we got a lot going on, a lot to look forward to. Make sure you like this video and subscribe, and then check out Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Thanks again. We appreciate it. Have a great rest of your Thursday, and we will check in with you tomorrow morning for the Morning Pit right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.